Miss Marple and the map that revealed a murder. Dear friends, a warm welcome back to Warm Chapters. I'm Thomas, and I'm truly grateful to have you here with us tonight as our cosy community continues to grow. Tell us where you're listening from and what time of day it is where you are. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new mystery. Now, get comfortable and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. The Strange Sketch. Found in an old book. October came to St. Mary Mead as it always did, without flourish and without noise, as though the year itself had quietly turned a page and wished no one to remark upon it. The warmth of summer did not vanish so much as recede with dignity, withdrawing from gardens and hedgerows inch by inch, until the air itself seemed thinner, sharper, more exact. The elms along the lane let go of their leaves in small, unhurried descents, and behind the low stone walls the kitchen gardens, lately so full of beans and marrows and practical abundance, stood now in a kind of stripped honesty. From cottage chimneys the scent of wood smoke drifted at all hours, and in the mornings there was that particular chill which carried with it not discomfort, but certainty. Autumn had established itself, and there was no arguing with it. Miss Jane Marple had always preferred October to the more generous seasons. It possessed a clearness of outline which she valued. Summer, for all its roses and brightness, could be deceptive. Its softened edges, blurred truths, tempted one into sentiment. October did not do that. In October one saw things as they were. A bird's nest, hidden for months by foliage, appeared suddenly in the bare fork of a shrub. A neglected gate leaned at a truer angle. Faces, too, became easier to read in the thinner light. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing people with more profit than they themselves suspected, valued clarity very highly indeed. Most human trouble, she had long thought, arose not from mystery but from the extraordinary determination people showed in avoiding what lay plainly before them. It was on such an afternoon, while seated at her sitting-room window with a length of Venetian lacework in her lap, that she observed old Mrs. Patten hurrying along the lane with an energy which, in that lady, was almost alarming. Mrs. Patten was not by temperament a hurried woman. She drifted. She paused at gates. She allowed conversations to bloom into quarter hours. To see her moving briskly, with her basket swinging and her chin set in a forward line of purpose, suggested at once that something had occurred in the village. Not something tragic, perhaps, but certainly something interesting. Miss Marple was not disappointed. The event, as she learned before long, had taken place in the charity shop. The shop occupied what had once been the premises of a bootmaker on the far side of the green, and had, for some years now, been maintained by the Ladies' Committee of St. Mary Mead for the noble and perpetually unfinished purpose of raising money for repairs to the church roof. It was a place of agreeable disorder, smelling faintly of old paper, lavender sachets, and dust warmed by weak autumn sun. Its shelves held the usual assortment of village cast-offs and minor survivors, chipped china, crocheted tea-cosies of doubtful vintage, odd volumes of encyclopedias, framed prints of sentimental landscapes, and books, always books, arranged along one entire wall in wavering lines. Books came and went in that place with curious regularity. Villagers announced they were having a clear out, and donated cartons of volumes they had no intention of reading again. Within a fortnight the shelves were as crowded as ever. It was among these books, on that particular Tuesday afternoon, that Mr. Philip Dawson made his discovery. Philip Dawson was a retired schoolmaster of 63, lean to the point of angularity, with a long, thoughtful face and a nose admirably shaped for peering into matters that interested him. He had taught geography and mathematics for 31 years at a grammar school in the neighbouring county, and had retired to St. Mary Mead upon a modest inheritance, which had afforded him a comfortable cottage in Orchard Road and a life of ordered leisure. He was well liked without being intimate with many. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak it was usually after a pause of consideration that gave his words a slightly scholastic weight. Since retiring, he had developed what he called puzzle hunting, by which he meant any occupation requiring patience, logic, and the pleasure of fitting scattered facts into an intelligible whole. He attacked cryptic crosswords with energy, local records with perseverance, and old parish oddities with an attention others reserve for politics or illness. On that Tuesday, he had been browsing without particular purpose when he drew from the shelf an old travel guide, a solid, comprehensive volume of the kind produced between the wars, its green cloth cover faded almost to grey at the corners, its pages thick and faintly brittle, its information long obsolete and therefore, to Philip Dawson's mind, all the more delightful. He carried it to the little table near the shop window and opened it with the sort of idle anticipation experienced by those who know that old books often contain more than they advertise. The folded paper had been tucked neatly between pages 47 and 48. At first glance it seemed no extraordinary thing, a single sheet of cartridge paper, yellowed softly with age, folded several times and bearing a pencil drawing. Yet Dawson, who had spent decades teaching boys to read maps properly rather than merely glance at them, knew at once that this was no casual sketch. The lines were deliberate, the hand was disciplined. Compass points had been marked in small, neat lettering. There were symbols placed at intervals across the page, a cross, a circle, a square, and each seemed to denote some fixed point of significance. The drawing represented unmistakably land to the north and east of the village. One could identify the curve of the stream, the rise behind the old orchard, the line of hedgerow where the path dipped toward the meadows. There was no title, no explanation, no date, and no signature. The symbols stood silent, withholding their meaning. Philip Dawson sat with it for some minutes, turning it carefully, examining the pressure of the pencil, the proportion of the spacing, the exactness of the markings. It was, beyond question, a puzzle, and not a trivial one. He purchased the book for sixpence, returned the map to its place between the pages, and carried it away with the air of a man who had unexpectedly acquired a very agreeable responsibility. Shortly before 4 o'clock, he entered the tea-room at the end of the high street and joined the company of the afternoon regulars. The tea-room was presided over by Mrs. Edna Fry, a capable woman whose Victoria sponge was excellent, and whose brisk manner prevented the place from dissolving into idleness, though she exercised mercy with her regular patrons. That afternoon there were 7 or 8 people present. Mrs. Patten and her sister, Miss Luring, Mr. Gerald Hartfield, the retired solicitor, permanently installed by the window like an article of furniture, 2 other villagers of the comfortable, well-documented sort, and Miss Marple herself, who had come down for her customary tea and for the society which she found not only pleasant but, on occasion, instructive. She sat in a corner near the fire, her knitting in her lap, apparently attending only in part to the room. It was an impression many people formed on first acquaintance, and very nearly all of them regretted later. Philip Dawson wasted no time. With obvious enjoyment, he drew out the old guidebook, unfolded the paper, and spread it beside Mrs. Patten's teacup. There followed at once the small communal stir produced in villages whenever curiosity is given an object. Heads bent, cups were shifted, spectacles were found, polished and employed. Dawson himself hovered above the paper with proprietary satisfaction. "It is clearly some sort of survey," he said, tapping the margin lightly with one finger. "The drawing is too exact for guesswork. Whoever made it knew what he was about. And these symbols, well, they are not decorative. They indicate fixed positions, places of importance." "Buried treasure," declared Miss Luring promptly, with the authority of a woman whose reading had been broad, if not always discriminating. There was a ripple of laughter. Dawson smiled. "One cannot altogether dismiss the possibility," he said, "though I confess I suspect something rather more practical. Wartime, perhaps. Hidden stores, documents, objects put away and intended to be recovered later." Mrs. Patten, with gratifying solemnity, said that her mother had buried the family silver teapot in 1940 and forgotten the precise spot. It had eventually been found by accident during the planting of cabbages, which led to a brief and lively exchange of village wartime memories. A gentleman at the next table proposed a Roman explanation so elaborate that nobody accepted it, though several enjoyed hearing it. The map passed from hand to hand. When it came to Miss Marple, she held it longer than most. She would not have claimed technical knowledge of maps. Geography had never been her subject. But what interested Miss Marple was not chiefly the land represented on the paper, but the person behind it. The thing had been drawn with patience, care, and a kind of guarded intention. Precision was never meaningless. When people were exact, it was usually because something mattered very much. Someone had wanted these locations preserved accurately. Someone had either feared forgetting them, or feared that another person might need, one day, to find them. That, to Miss Marple's mind, was already significant. She said none of this. She returned the paper with a pleasant murmur and took up her knitting again. Dawson refolded the map and restored it to the guidebook. "I mean to look into it," he said cheerfully. "A thing like this cannot simply be ignored. There may be a perfectly simple explanation, of course, but there may equally not." He rubbed his hands together, a habit of his whenever genuine intellectual pleasure stirred him. Miss Marple drew a length of pale blue wool through her fingers and reflected privately and without any dramatic sensation that a carefully drawn map concealed in an old book rarely led to anything perfectly simple at all. Outside, the October light lay low across the green, and the elm leaves fell in slow, circling patterns that were almost deliberate. Chapter 2. A Find Beside the Quarry Rim. Thursday, the 9th of October, broke over St. Mary Mead with a pale and rather reluctant sun. It was the sort of morning that seemed to have appeared only because the calendar insisted upon it. A light mist still clung to the meadows, softening the far hedges and turning distance into uncertainty. Rooks complained noisily from the elms. Mrs. Partridge's tabby cat, an animal with no rights whatever in Miss Marple's garden and no respect for the fact, sat upon the low wall wearing that expression of serene indifference by which cats appear to admit wrongdoing while denying all relevance. Miss Marple had been awake since 7. She breakfasted modestly, in the manner approved by her doctor and not wholly approved by herself, and then settled by the sitting-room window to answer correspondence. One letter was to a niece regarding a domestic complication, too trifling to be called serious and too irritating to be dismissed. The other was to an old friend in Dorset who had sent her a newspaper cutting about the restoration of a medieval dovecote, a subject which Miss Marple found genuinely absorbing. She was halfway through the second letter when she heard footsteps passing rapidly along the lane. Speed, in village life, is itself a form of communication. Miss Marple looked up at once. It was young Thomas Arkle, the postmaster's son, walking with the strained haste of one who has received alarming news and is not yet sure how far it ought to alarm him. He vanished around the bend toward the green. Miss Marple watched him go. Her pen suspended for a moment above the paper and then returned to her letter. But the sentence she had been composing had entirely deserted her. The news reached her before 9, carried in by Mrs. Roper, her daily help, who had plainly been waiting for the proper moment to produce it, and therefore did so with a grave satisfaction. Philip Dawson had been found near the old quarry. He had been discovered at approximately 7 that morning by Mr. Alfred Cook, a farmer who used the path skirting the quarry boundary, when going to inspect his winter wheat on the far side. From above, Cook had seen what he first took for some discarded bundle among the rough grass and broken stones below the upper edge. Going nearer, he had realised that it was a man. He had not attempted anything beyond confirming that help was needed. Instead, he had gone directly into the village, pale and abrupt in a fashion entirely unlike him, and raised the alarm. Dr. Llewellyn, who had ministered to St. Mary Mead and the surrounding district for nearly 20 years, arrived at the quarry within half an hour. He made his examination with professional thoroughness and found no obvious wound, no clear signs of struggle, and no disturbance of the ground beyond what the place itself might naturally account for. The edge of the quarry was rough and treacherous, patched with coarse grass and loose shale that shifted underfoot. His opinion, carefully formed and at first confidently given, was that Mr. Dawson had most likely slipped and fallen. It was plausible. Indeed, it was the kind of explanation villagers prefer, simple, regrettable, and free from implication. Constable Hobbs, a conscientious young man recently posted to the village and inclined to defer readily to established authority, recorded the facts and sent word to the county office. There seemed little immediate reason to challenge the doctor's view. The path was not maintained. There was no proper fence, only an ancient post and the remnants of wire long since surrendered to neglect. Dawson was no longer a young man. Men of 63, if careless on uncertain ground, might certainly fall. And yet there were details. His coat pockets, when examined, contained the old travel guide. Inside it, folded exactly as before, was the map he had shown so eagerly in the tea-room 2 days earlier. That was the point which Miss Marple turned over in her mind most persistently, as she sat with her knitting that afternoon. She had not gone to the quarry. She was not a woman who hurried towards scenes of death merely because others had done so. But from the various accounts brought to her through the morning, she had gathered what she needed. She asked, in her mild and apparently incidental fashion, several small questions which those answering seldom recognised as important until much later. Had Philip Dawson been in the habit of taking early walks? No, said Mrs. Roper, who knew the routines of the village as accurately as some people know railway timetables. Mr. Dawson was orderly. If he walked, he did so late in the morning along the main lane and back, never very far. He was not one of those men who tramped hedgerows before breakfast. Was the quarry a place commonly visited? Certainly not. The old Belem quarry had been disused since the late 1920s, and had since then stood in a state of quiet abandonment. Children had been warned away from it for 30 years. Sensible adults required no warning. Only the boundary path was ever used, and even that by necessity rather than preference. Had the map itself been properly examined after being found on him? Constable Hobbs, who had stopped at her gate during the morning to reassure her, as he had been doing, she suspected, with several of the village's older residents, said that it had been looked at and identified as some sort of drawing of local land. It would be forwarded with the deceased man's effects. He himself had not studied it closely. Miss Marple thanked him and made no comment. Now, in the quiet of her sitting room, she considered Philip Dawson not merely as an individual but as a type. One did not need intimacy to understand him. He had been a careful man, not timid. There was a great difference, but careful. He was methodical, exact, patient, and rather proud, in a modest way, of his own intelligence. Such a man, presented with an old map and a hidden pattern, would not behave rashly. He would compare landmarks. He would consult Parish records. He would make notes in a neat hand. He would proceed as he had no doubt taught generations of schoolboys to proceed, with order, with logic, and with due regard for error. He would not, Miss Marple thought, go out at dawn on a damp October morning and pick his way alone toward the edge of a disused quarry. Not unless something had induced him to do it. She drew another length of pale blue wool through her fingers and let the thought develop in its proper order. A telephone call, perhaps. A message delivered quietly the night before. A note left where he could not miss it. Something suggesting that the matter of the map had advanced suddenly and required private attention. Such invitations, when secrecy is desired, are often arranged for early hours. Fewer eyes, fewer questions. People are always absurdly hopeful that dawn itself possesses discretion. And Philip Dawson, she felt increasingly certain, had not been the only person in the tea-room to take a serious interest in the map. She saw again, in memory, the little gathering around the table, the faces bent over the paper. the look of amusement in some, curiosity in others. She reflected how many hands had touched that old sheet, how many pairs of eyes had examined its symbols, and how many of those eyes might have recognised more than their owners had chosen to admit. Human nature did not alter merely because people had respectable houses, good manners, and suitable ages. Miss Marple had seen that truth proved too often and in too many forms. Fear remained fear, greed remained greed, shame remained shame. The impulse to conceal, to defend, to silence, to prevent old things from coming into the light, those impulses survived education, church attendance, marriage, and all the polite arrangements of English village life. Philip Dawson had been a man who liked questions. That in itself could be dangerous. A person who asks questions in the right place may be praised as intelligent. A person who asks the wrong question of the wrong individual may suddenly become inconvenient. The afternoon light had shifted lower beyond the elms. Mrs. Roper had gone home. The cottage held that settled October stillness in which every sound seems to wait before making itself heard. Miss Marple laid down her knitting, folded her hands, and sat for some time without moving. There was, she thought, a great deal more in Philip Dawson's death than loose shale and damp grass. A very great deal more. Chapter 3. Autumn Talk on the Village Green. There is a particular character to gossip in a small English village, and it differs in several essential respects from the gossip of cities, or even of market towns. In a city, news travels quickly and dies young. A scandal flares brightly in one set of windows and is extinguished in another before anyone has properly examined it. It is pushed aside by the next disturbance, the next engagement, the next inconvenience. In a village, the process is more deliberate, and in its way, far more exacting. News is not merely passed on, it is handled. It moves from doorstep to doorstep with the care one might give a fragile piece of porcelain, and at every transfer it acquires a little more shape, a little more colour, a little more interpretation. Recollections are added, histories are revived, comparisons are drawn with things that happened 10, 20, even 30 years before. What emerges is not always fair, and certainly not always kind, but it is very seldom casual. Miss Marple had long thought that village gossip, for all its defects, was one of the oldest methods by which ordinary people attempt to restore order to events that threaten to resist explanation. By Friday morning, the death of Philip Dawson had been thoroughly received into that process. The Green at St Mary Mead in October was not the social theatre it became in June, when croquet hoops, church fetes, and the slow ceremonials of summer produced natural gatherings. Yet it was never empty. The bench beneath the old oak always found occupants. Those whose digestion recommended fresh air. Those who preferred outdoor observation to indoor company, and those who simply liked to place themselves where events might pass before them. The diagonal path across the grass linking the post office to the cottages beyond ensured a constant trickle of movement. People crossed it with letters, parcels, baskets, bits of local business, and, on mornings such as this, with opinions. Mrs. Fry opened the tea room at 9, and by 10 it had filled with the Friday constituency. Retired persons, ladies momentarily free of domestic responsibilities, and one or two others whose lives presented no urgent obligations, and whose consciences did not suffer greatly from the fact. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes after 10. She had first stopped at the post office to send off her letter to Dorset, and then proceeded to the tea room, where she took her customary corner table, ordered tea, and settled her knitting quietly in her lap. To a stranger she would have appeared exactly what she seemed, a small, elderly gentlewoman with white hair, pink cheeks, and a private occupation. It was an appearance of singular usefulness. Those who knew her better understood that very little escaped her, though few of them could have explained precisely how such a soft, harmless presence managed to be so extraordinarily attentive. Around her, conversation rose and intersected in the usual village fashion, fragmented, repetitive, and deeply informative. At the large table near the window, Mrs. Patten was engaged in a full and stately review of Philip Dawson's character. Her sister, Miss Luring, sat beside her with the expression of one prepared to agree wherever agreement seemed useful, and two other ladies contributed occasionally in tones so similar that even Miss Marple, who prided herself on distinctions, had never fully separated one from the other in her mind. "He was always very precise," said Mrs. Patten, using the word, as she often did, to indicate a cluster of virtues and peculiarities too numerous to classify individually. "Very particular about how things were done, not in the least the sort of man to act on impulse." "Which makes it all the stranger," said Miss Luring with satisfaction, for she had made this same observation several times since Thursday, and clearly still found it persuasive. What could have possessed him to go to that dreadful quarry so early in the morning? "Curiosity, perhaps," suggested Mrs. Hendry, who liked practical explanations because they spared her the trouble of imagining disagreeable ones. "He was very interested in that map after all. Perhaps he simply wanted to see what it meant." "At 7 o'clock in the morning," said Mrs. Patten. "Nonsense. Philip Dawson was not an early riser. Mrs. Roper told me so distinctly, and she would know. He never took breakfast before 8. Very steady in his habits." That detail produced a silence of brief but genuine consideration. Miss Marple did not join the conversation. She sat with her knitting, appearing to count stitches. In reality, she was listening with care. The village was doing what it always did, collecting facts in one basket, assumptions in another, and mixing them together until the distinction between the two became difficult for less disciplined minds to recover. Still, useful things emerged. One learned what people found natural, what they found strange, and most importantly of all, what they repeated. Repetition often marked the point at which thought had encountered difficulty and was trying to smooth it over. At the counter, Mr. Gerald Hartfield, the retired solicitor, stood waiting for his coffee and speaking in low tones to Mrs. Fry. Hartfield was a compact, neat man in late middle age, always properly dressed and always just slightly drier in expression than the occasion required. He had spent long years in the law and had come away from it with habits of caution that no retirement could dissolve. He did not speculate when facts were available, and when facts were not available, he usually preferred silence. "The question," he was saying, "is whether the police mean to examine the matter properly. Hobbs is conscientious enough, but he is young. If the inspector is satisfied with the doctor's first opinion, then the whole thing may be left where it stands." "And do you think it ought not to be?" asked Mrs. Fry, sliding his coffee toward him without losing command of the teapot in her other hand. Hartfield considered the matter for a moment before replying. "I think," he said at last, "that it has the appearance of an accident and the texture of something else. Whether that will be enough to trouble official minds is another question." He took his cup and went to the window table, where he unfolded his newspaper with the air of a man who had said all he intended to say. Miss Marple found that she agreed with him. An agreement with Gerald Hartfield was seldom careless. He was not imaginative, but he was sound. If a man like Hartfield admitted uneasiness, there was usually something to justify it. The most valuable conversation of the morning, however, did not take place in the tea-room at all. On her way home, Miss Marple paused at the bench beneath the old oak, explaining her stop, when explanation was required, by reference to her feet, which in point of fact were not troubling her in the least. There she found Mr. Herbert Swain, the retired postman, seated in his habitual place, and surveying the green with the composed neutrality of a man who has spent a lifetime observing without intruding. Herbert Swain was 71 and had walked every lane, path and muddy shortcut in the parish for 40 years. Men like Herbert are often overlooked, not because they are unimportant, but because they are too familiar to be properly seen. He was neither rich nor forceful, neither eccentric nor celebrated. He had delivered letters to every household in St. Mary Mead and its outskirts, and in doing so had acquired a knowledge of local geography and local history that was almost scholarly in extent, though wholly unadvertised. He also possessed another rarer quality. He was truthful, Not tactful, certainly, but truthful. He said what he knew without embroidery and refused, by instinct rather than principle, to say more. Terrible business about Mr. Dawson, he remarked, after they had exchanged the usual observations about the weather and the rather disappointing condition of the vicarage chrysanthemums. Very sad indeed, said Miss Marple. Did you know him well? Oh, to speak to. He came into the post office now and then to send parcels, packed them neatly. You can generally tell something about a man from the way he packs a parcel. Miss Marple turned to him with interest. And what did that tell you? About Mr. Dawson? Herbert Swain reflected for a moment. That he liked things in their proper place, he said, and that he didn't do anything in a hurry. No, said Miss Marple softly. That was my impression also. A pair of sparrows were quarrelling over something in the grass at their feet. Herbert observed them mildly before resuming. I know that ground near Belham Quarry, he said. Used to walk it regular enough years ago. Wouldn't go there now without a reason. Nothing there worth seeing, and the footing's bad. When did the quarry close? Asked Miss Marple. 1928 or 29 thereabouts. Stone ran out, or near enough. After that the place just sat. During the war people said the paths round there were used for various things. Moving stores, keeping things out of sight, that sort of thing. He paused, then added with that same plain exactness. There was a surveyor fellow worked that land in those days. Covered. Every inch of it, he did. Saw him often enough with his notebooks and instruments. Miss Marple's knitting stilled very slightly in her hands. Did you indeed? Arthur Belham, said Herbert. Thin man. Particular about his boots. Lodged with Mrs. Alderton on Back Lane for a while. Must have been here close on a year. Then one day he wasn't. Do you know why he left? Herbert shook his head. No. There was talk, of course, but nothing you could call certain. Some said the job was finished. Others thought something had happened. Couldn't say what, but he was a careful sort, thorough, the kind of man who kept records. Miss Marple absorbed this in silence. It fitted rather too well with the shape of things already in her mind. I wonder, she said after a moment in her mildest voice, whether anyone has considered why Mr. Dawson should have had a map of the Quarry district at all. Herbert Swain looked at her directly. I heard about the map, he said. Doesn't surprise me if there was one. Belham made maps of everything. That was his trade. Quite, said Miss Marple. She did not pursue the subject, though she thought a great deal more about it as she walked home. The village had adopted the comfortable explanation that Philip Dawson, being intrigued by the map, had gone to investigate and met with an unfortunate fall. Comfortable explanations are always well received because they require so little courage. They close doors, they settle nerves, they ask nothing of the people who accept them. Yet the same objections returned to her steadily. Philip Dawson's habits, the hour, the map still folded in his pocket, as though he'd not yet truly used it. Above all, Herbert Swain's quiet, accurate judgment. He was not a man who rushed. A man who did not rush did not suddenly set out before breakfast for a disused quarry merely because curiosity had pricked him. If he had gone there, he had gone for a reason, and if he had gone for a reason, then some other mind had supplied it. Miss Marple let herself into the cottage, removed her coat and sat for some moments at the writing table without taking up her pen. Outside, October continued its still and secretive business. The rooks called once over the elms and then fell silent. There was, she felt, something waiting just beneath the surface of these events, something not yet visible, but already beginning to press upward through them. Chapter 4. The former surveyor of the house. Miss Marple had always maintained that county record offices were among the most undervalued institutions in England. Libraries, of course, enjoyed the esteem they deserved. Everyone understood in a vague but approving way what a library was for. But a record office occupied a less fortunate place in the public imagination. Those who had never consulted one tended to picture it as a repository of dust, bad lighting, and specialists of forbidding enthusiasm inhabited by elderly clerks who treasured documents of no possible interest to ordinary people. Miss Marple knew better. She had found, over the course of a long life, that forgotten things were often the most revealing. The truth has a way of slipping from drawing rooms and resurfacing in registers, old ledgers, letters, and memoranda no one expected to matter again. She did not, however, go to the record office herself. Her hip, which had become increasingly opinionated since the previous winter, made the journey to the county town unwise in damp weather, and Miss Marple was not one of those foolish women who confuse stubbornness with energy. She knew her limitations exactly. She also knew, with equal exactness, which acquaintances could be depended upon to act on her behalf. Miss Ellen Pell was 44, unmarried, and employed part-time by the local historical society in a role she called research assistant, and others described, with justice, as a remarkably efficient finder of things. She lived in a terraced cottage at the edge of the village, kept a large tortoiseshell cat of severe opinions, and possessed a mind unusually well adapted to archives. She was not especially sociable. Indeed, Miss Marple suspected she found most people more tiring than interesting. But she was intelligent, discreet, and dependable, which in matters of inquiry counted for a great deal more. On Friday evening Miss Marple had telephoned her and mentioned, in a pleasant and deceptively casual way, that she had become curious about a surveyor named Arthur Belham, who had worked locally during the war, and wondered whether any official records relating to his activities might still exist in the county office. Miss Pell, whose instinctive response to a question was the desire to answer it, had readily agreed to go on Monday. She returned on Tuesday afternoon with a manila folder, a sensible pair of gloves, and the quiet look of a person moderately pleased with the success of her expedition. "There is rather more than I expected," she said, accepting a cup of tea and settling into the armchair opposite Miss Marple. "That is very often the case with old records," said Miss Marple. Miss Pell opened the folder across her knees. "Arthur Belham was a chartered surveyor," she began. "Properly qualified. He had a practice in the Midlands before the war. In 1941 he came to this county under engagement to the Agricultural Authority, carrying out wartime land surveys. It appears to have been part of a larger administrative effort, accurate records of boundaries, drainage, access routes, outbuildings, and so forth. Practical matters, but important ones. The ministry wanted reliable local information for crop planning, storage, and emergency arrangements. "A responsible post," said Miss Marple. "Very much so, and from everything I saw he was good at it. The surviving reports are detailed, precise, and heavily annotated. He was not a careless man." Miss Pell paused. Her pauses always indicated that the next point interested her even more than the last. "He remains in the records until the autumn of 1942, she said. "Then he disappears. There are no further reports under his name, no completion papers, no formal end to his assignment, no explanatory correspondence. The trail simply stops." "How very suggestive," said Miss Marple. "I thought so too. I asked the archivist, who has been there an extraordinarily long time and knows the collection almost by instinct." She remembered Belham's file for a particular reason. Some years ago, she could not be exact, perhaps 15 years, perhaps rather more, a man came in asking specifically for Belham's wartime surveys. Miss Marple set down her teacup with delicate care. "Did he indeed?" "He spent some time with the files," Miss Pell continued, "but did not ask for copies. What the archivist remembered was that he seemed to know a good deal already. He was not searching in the ordinary way. His questions were very specific, as though he wanted not to discover the records, but to verify something about them." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, "that would be unusual." She was silent for a little while, and Miss Pell, who understood that Miss Marple's silences were rarely empty, did not hurry to fill it. "At any point," Miss Marple asked at last, "is the area around Belham Quarry mentioned?" Miss Pell consulted her notes. "Yes, in 2 reports. Belham surveyed that district quite thoroughly in the summer of 1942. One of the entries refers to structures in the area, including a disused mill building to the northeast of the quarry. "A mill?" said Miss Marple. "Yes. It does not appear on current maps. I gather it was later demolished, though I could not determine when." "Thank you, Miss Pell. You have been most helpful." Miss Pell accepted the compliment with the modest satisfaction of a person who values competent work. She finished her tea, gathered up the folder and departed in a state of mild professional contentment, leaving behind her an atmosphere of documents, half-solved questions and increasing significance. Miss Marple remained in her chair for some time after the door had closed. Arthur Bellum had surveyed the quarry land thoroughly in the summer of 1942. He had drawn maps, careful, professional maps. Then, in the autumn, he vanished from the record without explanation. Years later, a man had appeared at the archives already knowing enough to ask the right questions. Such a man had not been merely curious. He had wanted to know what remained on paper, and perhaps more importantly what did not. It was while she was still considering this that she heard the knock. Inspector Frederick Ramsden arrived at 4:15. He had driven down from the county office after receiving a second communication from Constable Hobbs, who, to his credit, had evidently proved less satisfied by the accident theory than his deferential manner suggested. Ramsden was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, weather-coloured, and deliberate in both speech and movement. He had once before encountered Miss Marple in connection with another matter some years earlier, and although he would never have phrased it in sentimental terms, he had formed an opinion of her intelligence that amounted to careful respect. He accepted tea — he was not a man to reject tea when properly offered — and took the visitor's chair. "I understand," he said, in the measured tone of someone who preferred to begin quietly, "that you knew Mr. Dawson." "A pleasant acquaintance rather than a close one," said Miss Marple. "Though in village terms he had been here long enough to be understood. He was orderly in his habits, quiet in manner, and fond of puzzles of the logical variety." "So I have gathered." Ramsden produced a notebook, more from habit than necessity. "You were present when he showed the map in the tea-room." "I was." "What did you make of it?" Miss Marple considered. "Technically very little," she said. "I'm no authority on maps as such, but I thought it had been drawn with professional care. It was not an amateur sketch. The hand was exact. As for the effect upon those present, most seemed to regard it as a curiosity, something entertaining, a village diversion." "Most?" said Ramsden. Miss Marple observed, not for the first time, that he noticed qualifications. "For the most part," she said. She did not enlarge on the remark, and he, with equal discipline, did not force her. He asked instead about Philip Dawson's demeanour, about the gathering in the tea-room, and about anything she had noticed in the interval before his death. Miss Marple answered with great exactness. She offered what she knew, and carefully withheld what she merely suspected. Suspicion, she believed, should not be shared until it had gathered enough weight to deserve another person's attention. Not yet, she thought, but soon. Ramsden left shortly after 5 with the expression of a man who had acquired several useful fragments without yet seeing how they fitted together. Miss Marple watched his motor car disappear down the lane and then returned to her armchair. Arthur Bellum had walked every inch of the land around the quarry. He had made maps of structures, paths, boundaries, and whatever else the wartime authorities required. Then he had disappeared. Later, someone had taken the trouble to inspect the surviving records in the county archive, asking not broad but pointed questions. Maps, Miss Marple reflected, were not merely records of geography. They were records of intention. They showed where a person had looked, what he had thought worth marking, and sometimes what he had wished another person to find. And the map Philip Dawson had discovered, folded, carefully inside an old book and left, hidden among the harmless clutter of a charity shop shelf, had not come there by accident. Someone had placed it there. Someone had preserved it. The question was whether that person had been unable to destroy it, or unwilling. Outside, the afternoon faded into evening. Across the lane, cottage windows lit one by one, making soft gold squares in the dusk. The village settled into its ordinary quiet, but Miss Marple sat very still, turning the question over in her mind as one turns a stone in the hand, feeling for the sharper edge underneath. Chapter 5. An Old Tale of Hidden Treasure. There existed in St Mary Mead a small but remarkably persistent historical society, one of those village institutions which survive less by public enthusiasm than by the tireless devotion of 2 or 3 individuals who refuse to let them die. It met on the second Wednesday of each month in the back room of the village hall, where the attendance varied only slightly with weather, influenza, and the quality of the previous meeting's refreshments. 11 members could be counted upon with reasonable certainty. 4 others appeared when circumstances allowed and generally paid their subscriptions, with that hopeful delay peculiar to persons fully intending to become more organised in the near future. The society maintained a modest but respectable collection of local materials, photographs, parish papers, minor artefacts of uncertain glamour but genuine relevance, displayed in 2 glass-fronted cabinets at the side of the room. It also produced, at irregular intervals, a newsletter read by approximately 30 people, though read perhaps more thoroughly than publications of much greater circulation. Within it, among notices of lectures, reminders about borrowed items not yet returned, and appeals for help with cataloguing, there occasionally appeared articles of real value on the history of the parish and its outskirts, its secretary, and in every practical sense its sustaining force was Mr. Cyril Mossop. Mr. Mossop was 68 years of age, compactly built, and possessed of a memory for local history which, within its chosen field, had no rival in the village. He had been born in St Mary Mead, had spent nearly 30 years working in the county town as a surveyor's draftsman, a professional detail Miss Marple did not overlook, and had then retired to the village of his birth to pursue, with the full diligence of a man finally released from interruption, the historical interest that had occupied his spare hours for most of his life. He wore in all seasons a tweed jacket of indeterminate age, and maintained a polite, slightly absent expression, which suggested vagueness to the superficial observer, though in reality his mind was both quick and exact. Miss Marple had known him for years, and had long considered him one of those people who become especially valuable when old history and practical fact begin to overlap. Accordingly, on Monday, the same day she had spoken to Miss Pell, she sent him a short note asking whether he might care to take tea with her on Wednesday afternoon. He accepted at once, with the gratifying promptness of a man who is secretly delighted to be invited to discuss something interesting. He arrived exactly on time. Miss Marple had always thought punctuality one of the more revealing human habits. In a man like Cyril Mossop it did not merely indicate good manners, it suggested inward order. He came in, accepted tea and a slice of seed cake, and almost immediately acquired the look of a person only half present in the room, because the better part of him had already moved ahead into the subject. Miss Marple, who preferred people to approach conclusions in their own way whenever possible, allowed the conversation to begin properly. They spoke first of ordinary things, the weather, which had turned sharper, the regrettable death of poor Philip Dawson, the continuing question of the church hall roof, that perennial monument to village perseverance and insufficient funds. Only when these had been given their due did she lead the conversation, by the indirect route she generally favoured, toward the point she wished to examine. "I have been wondering," she said in a tone of mild reflection, "about the practice during the war of concealing valuables in the countryside. One heard of such things, of course, but only vaguely. Was it common in this district?" Cyril Mossop set down his teacup with unmistakable animation. "Much more common than people now remember," he said. "There was a very great deal of anxiety in the early 1940s, entirely understandable anxiety. Not everyone believed invasion likely, of course, but a great many preferred to make arrangements on the assumption that the worst might happen. In rural places particularly, where evacuees had brought what they could and were often unwilling to leave their remaining, possessions in situations they considered insecure, there was a tendency toward private concealment. "And so things were hidden," said Miss Marple. "And so things were hidden," he repeated. "Silver, jewellery, documents, in some cases small quantities of cash. The methods were seldom systematic. Most were improvised. A tin beneath a tree, a box under loose bricks, something tucked into an outbuilding and then carefully not mentioned aloud. The difficulty, naturally, was that memory proved far less dependable than people imagined it would." He spoke with the slight restrained satisfaction of a historian who has spent years observing the practical consequences of human optimism. "The war lasted longer than many expected," he continued. "Families were separated. Some did not return. Some returned to places altered just enough that certainty became impossible. Hedgerows had been cut back, walls repaired, sheds removed. A field one had once crossed in a straight line, now contained some new obstacle or division. There are, to my knowledge, items hidden in this parish during the 1940s which have never been recovered." "How extraordinary," said Miss Marple. "Not really," said Mossop, "only human." He accepted a second slice of seed cake with the absent-minded gratitude of a man who values food but not so much as information. "There was also, in some cases," he went on, "a more organised arrangement, not official in the strict sense, but organised nonetheless. Certain persons, men thought trustworthy, capable of keeping exact records, were entrusted with noting hiding places on behalf of several families. The idea was that such records would be safer in one careful hand than dispersed among frightened or distracted people." Miss Marple let a small pause fall before asking, "And were such records kept in this area?" Mossop looked at her with interest and something a little more than interest. "You are thinking of Belem," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "I had not meant to be quite so obvious." "You were not," said Mossop kindly, "but it is the natural connection." He leaned back a little, his expression altering into that careful reserve which comes over conscientious people when they begin to approach the boundary between rumour and evidence. "I am not entirely certain," he said, "how much of what was later said about Belem was fact, and how much grew afterward from people's desire to believe there had been a proper system behind what was really a series of improvised arrangements. One must be careful with retrospective village legend. Still, the rumours were persistent. Belem was thought by some to have been entrusted with records of hidden property during the course of his survey work. It would have made sense. He was already walking the land. He had professional reasons to note locations accurately. And he was, by all accounts, a man who inspired confidence. "By all accounts," Miss Marple repeated gently. "You sound as though you have some reservation." Mossop was silent for a moment. Miss Marple watched him with quiet sympathy. He was not a gossiping man. She had always respected him for that, but he was, at heart, devoted to accuracy. And for people of that kind, there are moments when withholding a relevant fact begins to feel less like discretion than like negligence. "At some years' distance," he said at last, "I came into possession of a letter. It was among papers donated from the estate of Mrs. Constance Alderton. You may remember her. She kept lodgings on Back Lane." "And Belem stayed with her," said Miss Marple. "Just so. The letter was written by Belem to Mrs. Alderton shortly before he left the village. Its wording is careful, painfully careful really, and not entirely direct. But the general impression is unmistakable. Belem had become aware that someone associated with his work had acted improperly in relation to items or information entrusted to him. He felt, as the letter suggests, unable to continue his engagement here afterwards." Miss Marple sat very still. "He does not name the person." "No. On the contrary, he avoids naming anyone with considerable deliberation." "Which suggests," said Miss Marple, "that he had reason to be cautious." "Yes. He may have feared the letter would be read by others, or he may not have felt himself able to prove what he suspected. But the implication is strong. Something entrusted for safekeeping, something noted, perhaps recorded, perhaps theoretically protected, had not remained where it ought. Items, or information about items, had in some degree found their way elsewhere. The room was quiet. Outside, a blackbird was searching the garden border with a seriousness equal to any professional investigator. "Did anyone follow it up?" Miss Marple asked after a moment. "Not so far as I have ever discovered. The war was still underway. People had larger matters occupying them. Belham himself returned to the Midlands and, as far as the surviving record shows, never publicly pursued the issue." Mossop folded his hands in his lap. "I have always found that curious," he said. "A meticulous man does not usually abandon a matter of principle without cause." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "he felt he lacked sufficient proof." "Perhaps. Or perhaps," she added softly, "the proof he had placed him at a personal disadvantage." Mossop looked at her with quickened interest. "That," he said, "is a possibility I had not fully considered." After that, the conversation moved, as good conversation sometimes do, into calmer channels. Mossop spoke of a recent acquisition of 18th century parish records, which had unexpectedly illuminated patterns of land tenure in the eastern section of the parish. Miss Marple listened attentively, for she had long held that the ownership of land is never a merely historical question. People inherit more than acreage. They inherit silence, grievances, obligations, and the remains of old arrangements that never quite disappear. When he had gone, Miss Marple remained in her chair for a considerable time, with her knitting idle in her lap and the seed cake neglected upon its plate. So, items entrusted to wartime safekeeping had been quietly appropriated. Mossop's careful phrase, carefully chosen, and therefore likely accurate, had been someone associated with his work. Belham had known, or believed he knew, who that person was. He had not dared name them, even in a private letter. He had left the village and not returned. And now, after all those decades, a map had surfaced in a charity shop. A map drawn, almost certainly, by Belham's own professional hand, a map marking places no current record now acknowledged. And the man who had found it lay dead beside the very stretch of land that map seemed to describe. The connection, Miss Marple thought, was not obscure at all. On the contrary, it had become rather plain, provided one had assembled the pieces in their proper order. What remained uncertain was the precise nature of what had once been taken, by whom it had been taken, and whether any trace of it still endured, or whether that question too had, in some fashion, been settled at the Quarry edge on Thursday morning. She picked up her knitting at last. The pale blue wool slipped through her fingers, and the October light withdrew by degrees into that soft grey dusk in which outlines blur, but thoughts, sometimes, become sharper. Chapter 6. Tensions within the Parish Committee. The Parish Council of St Mary Mead met on the third Thursday of each month in the village hall, a red-brick Victorian building whose heating arrangements had for nearly 20 years provided a separate and continuous line of negotiation between the council and the church authorities. The hall served many purposes: jumble sales, whist drives, children's dancing classes on Saturday mornings, and all the miscellaneous functions by which village life sustains itself. Like many such buildings, it was at once everybody's concern and nobody's complete responsibility. In autumn, those obliged to attend evening meetings learned by experience to bring an extra cardigan or scarf, with the result that council gatherings on colder nights displayed a degree of layered woolens not entirely compatible with official dignity. Miss Marple did not attend parish council meetings herself. She was not a member, and had long ago formed the opinion, confirmed repeatedly by observation, that the fullest account of any formal meeting was seldom to be found in its minutes. Minutes record what people decide ought to have been said. The truth more often resides in the conversations before and after, in hallways, near coat stands, by the door while gloves are being pulled on, those moments in which people forget to be procedural and become candid instead. For that reason, she was particularly receptive on the Friday morning following Wednesday's meeting, when she encountered Mrs. Agnes Holt at the post office. Mrs. Holt, wife of the council's longest-serving member, was a woman of 60, whose face wore by default an expression of mild but enduring indignation at the management of the world. It did not arise from ill nature. On the contrary, it sprang from a sincere and deeply rooted belief that most things could and should be run rather better than they were. She was an accurate reporter, though not always a colourless one, and possessed the useful inability to meet an acquaintance without at once imparting whatever recent event had most occupied her thoughts. "Miss Marple," she said, the instant Miss Marple had retrieved her letters from the counter, "you will have heard, I suppose, about the scene at the council meeting." Miss Marple had heard nothing whatever, but arranged her expression to imply that she possessed fragments, and would be grateful for completion. "Leonard Graves was altogether impossible," said Mrs. Holt, with the air of someone who had been waiting for an appropriate audience, and had now found one. Quite dismissive. "Well, not of the whole matter. That is what was so curious. He was willing enough to discuss poor Philip Dawson, and the accident and all the rest of it. It was specifically the map he would not hear of." "In what sense would not hear of it?" Miss Marple asked. "In the sense," said Mrs. Holt, drawing herself up with satisfaction, "that whenever anyone mentioned it, and several people did because naturally people are curious, and there's nothing improper in curiosity, he became most emphatic. He said it was irresponsible to encourage speculation about an old drawing when there was a death involved. He said the map was obviously of no significance and that dwelling upon it was foolish, even disrespectful." "I see," said Miss Marple. "Now there is something to be said for discretion," Mrs. Holt continued, in the tone of a woman preparing to say precisely the opposite. "But there is discretion, and there is suppression, and this felt very much like the second. George said afterward that he had never seen Leonard quite so." She paused. "George used the word emphatic, and you know he is not a man given to dramatic views of other people's behaviour." Miss Marple did know it. George Holt was genial, fair-minded, and seldom disturbed by anything short of genuine impropriety. If he had found Leonard Graves's conduct remarkable, it had likely been so. "Was anything specific said to provoke him?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Holt considered. "Miss Pell was there," she said, "as an observer because of the Historical Society's business about cabinet space, and she mentioned, in a perfectly straightforward way, that she had been doing a little research connected with the map, and that Arthur Bellham had been a genuine wartime surveyor whose records still existed in the county office. She was merely giving context." But Leonard Graves interrupted her almost before she had finished, and said local historical matters were not the business of the council, and the meeting must confine itself to its proper agenda. "Miss Pell can hardly have found that very satisfactory." "She was outwardly composed," said Mrs. Holt. "That is her way. But afterward, while we were putting on our coats, she said she thought his reaction was disproportionate for a man with no connection to the matter." Miss Marple made some agreeable observation about the weather, tucked her letters beneath her arm, and took her leave. Both ladies parted pleased, Mrs. Holt because she'd communicated something of consequence, and Miss Marple because she'd received it. As she walked home, she thought carefully about Leonard Graves. He was a man of about 65, solidly established, the kind of person who comes to seem less like an individual than like part of the permanent furniture of village respectability. He had served on the parish council for 12 years, was active in church affairs, and could always be relied upon to chair a meeting with firmness and proper regard for procedure. People described him as sound, which in England is praise of a specific and serious kind. He lived in one of the larger houses on the east side of the village, a Georgian property that had been in his family for some years, and enjoyed a private income sufficient to maintain both house and position. Miss Marple had never, until now, found reason to inquire too closely into his earlier professional life. She found herself wondering about it now. A man who interrupted Miss Pell so promptly at the mention of Bellham's survey records might indeed have been motivated by simple procedural fastidiousness. That was possible. But Miss Marple had spent too many years studying the minor variations of human behaviour to confuse general propriety with targeted alarm. True procedural people object in a broad, even-handed way. They do not strike precisely, instantly, at one specific topic, unless that topic has already occupied their thoughts. That was the detail that interested her most. Leonard Graves had responded too quickly. He had not merely disliked what Miss Pell was saying, he had seemed prepared for it. Miss Marple was still considering this when she reached her cottage and found, to her mild surprise, that the front gate stood open. It should not have been open. More surprising still, there was a figure standing on the path, examining her late flowering chrysanthemums with an air of uninvited familiarity. As Miss Marple came nearer, the figure resolved itself into Mrs. Dorothy Crane. Mrs. Crane was a woman of 70, whom Miss Marple knew only slightly, and had never quite placed. She had come to St. Mary Mead 6 or 7 years earlier after her husband's death, and had settled into village life with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already practiced such adaptations elsewhere. She was thin, quietly well-dressed, and had one of those faces in which numerous lines somehow arranged themselves into pleasantness rather than severity. She assisted now and then at the charity shop, which was where Miss Marple had most often encountered her. "Miss Marple," she said, turning at the sound of the gate with no visible embarrassment at being discovered on someone else's path. "I hoped I might find you at home. I wonder whether I might speak to you for a few minutes." Miss Marple said, "Of course," and ushered her inside. Tea was produced for the 3rd time that week in the service of Miss Marple's understanding of events, and if such service required some labour, it was labour she never begrudged. Mrs. Crane accepted her cup, sat in the visitor's chair, and for a moment seemed occupied in arranging her thoughts into an order that would allow them to be spoken. At last she said, "It was I who donated the travel guide, the one with the map." Miss Marple did not interrupt. Mrs. Crane appeared grateful for this. "I had been clearing a box of books from the attic," she said. "Mostly my husband's books. He had a great many. I have been sorting them gradually, as one does. I did not know the map was in that one. I want to make that very clear. I had no idea." "I believe you entirely," said Miss Marple, and she did. The difference between concealed knowledge and genuine ignorance is often subtle in description, but unmistakable in person. Mrs. Crane had the air of someone troubled by an unforeseen consequence, not the more effortful air of someone managing a falsehood. "When I heard what had happened to poor Mr. Dawson," Mrs. Crane continued, "I felt very uncomfortable. Not guilty precisely because I had not known, but troubled. And then I began to think more carefully about where the book had come from." She paused. "My husband worked for a time as an assistant to a surveyor. This was many years ago, before we were married. I believe the surveyor's name was Bellum." The little clock on the mantel marked the silence with a small, steady ticking. "I see," said Miss Marple gently. "My husband never spoke of that period very much. He said only that the work had not suited him, and that he had moved on to other things, which was true enough. He later went into business and did well. But after all this talk of maps and the Quarry and wartime surveys, I found myself remembering small things. Nothing direct. Little turns of speech, hints of difficulty. The sense that there had been some unpleasantness he preferred not to look at too closely." She held her teacup in both hands. Then she looked at Miss Marple directly. "I think my husband may have known more about that map than I did," she said. "And I thought you ought to know." Miss Marple smiled at her with genuine warmth. "I am very glad you came." Mrs. Crane gave a faint apologetic smile in return. "I am not quite sure why I came to you in particular," she admitted. "Only people say—" She stopped. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "They say that you notice things." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I try to," she said. "It is a habit I acquired very early, and I have never quite succeeded in abandoning it." She poured a little more tea. The fire settled softly in the grate. Outside, the October afternoon was withdrawing from the garden, drawing the light out of it by slow, careful degrees, and Miss Marple, though she didn't show it, felt that the pattern had tightened considerably. A dead man, a hidden map, a vanished surveyor, a wartime suspicion of theft, Leonard Graves reacting too quickly, and now a widow quietly admitting that her husband, once Bellum's assistant, may have known more than anyone, had guessed. The village, outwardly so ordinary, had begun to reveal that old and familiar truth. Nothing buried by human hands remains buried forever. Some things wait in earth, others wait in memory, and once disturbed, either kind may prove equally dangerous. Chapter 7. An Errand to the Derelict Mill. There are certain October days which seem specially arranged for the purposes of thought. They do not possess the brisk brightness that invites immediate action, nor the dreary heaviness that sends sensible people indoors in search of fires and blankets. They fall somewhere between the two, still, lucid, faintly golden, so that the world appears at once familiar and slightly altered, as though its ordinary features had drawn a little apart and were waiting to be properly noticed. The air on such days has a peculiar quality of restraint. Sound carries differently. Distances seem more exact. One has the impression, difficult to define but very real, that if one looked long enough and with sufficient patience, something overlooked might at last consent to be seen. Saturday the 14th was such a day. Miss Marple spent the greater part of the morning at her writing table, though not in writing. She had always maintained that thinking and writing were quite different occupations and not always compatible ones. Before her lay the pencil copy of the map which Miss Pell had made, with her usual exactness, before the original was retained at Inspector Ramsden's office. The sheet had been secured against the draft by a series of household objects pressed into temporary service. A small glass paperweight, a volume of Tennyson, the ink bottle, and a tin of hand cream that happened to be conveniently near. Miss Marple had studied the copy on and off for 3 days now, not as an expert in cartography, which she was not, but as a person who had lived in and about St. Mary Mead all her life, and who therefore possessed that kind of practical geographical knowledge, far more intimate than theory. She knew the countryside not by survey lines or official descriptions, but by use, memory and repetition. She knew where the stream bent away from the lower meadow and where it ran straight again past the old orchard. She knew which ridge kept the evening light and which lost it early. She knew where the ground dipped, where it held water in wet weather, where brambles thickened, where old paths used to run before fields were altered and hedges cut back. A place known over many decades settles itself into the mind with an accuracy no formal instruction can quite rival. Several of the symbols on the copied map had begun to yield themselves to that sort of knowledge. The cross at the eastern edge, set slightly back from what appeared to be a watercourse, she believed almost certainly marked the old stone bridge near the far boundary of Callow Farm, long since replaced by an ugly concrete construction lacking all charm. The small square to the north might indicate some former outbuilding, perhaps a shed or storehouse, once standing near a field line and now entirely gone. But there remained one symbol that resisted her efforts and returned to her attention repeatedly. It was a double circle, 2 concentric rings drawn with the same patient deliberation as everything else on the page. It lay to the northeast of the quarry, near what seemed to be the meeting of 2 lines that might represent paths, ditches, or field boundaries. Miss Marple had looked at it for 3 days without arriving at a satisfactory conclusion. It was Miss Pell who solved the matter. She arrived at the cottage shortly after 11, with that characteristic air of quiet directness, which always suggested she had come not merely to pay a call, but to deliver an answer. "The mill," she said, before her coat was quite off. "The double circle on the map. I consulted a surveying manual of the period. It is consistent with the notation for a watermill, more, particularly for the wheel housing. The concentric rings represent the wheel pit." Miss Marple looked down at the copied symbol and experienced the small but definite satisfaction that attends the proper placing of a missing piece. "The abandoned mill bellum mentioned in his report," she said. "Exactly." Miss Pell accepted tea with a brief nod of thanks and sat down with the controlled energy of a person who had already been out in the field and was pleased for the moment to be indoors. "I went to see it this morning," she said. "There is very little left. The main structure has collapsed almost entirely. Only portions of the foundation remain visible, and even those are heavily overgrown." but the wheel pit itself can still be identified if one knows where to look. It is stone-lined, which is why it has endured when everything else has gone. And its position? Asked Miss Marple. Approximately 400 yards northeast of the quarry, said Miss Pell. There is, in theory, an old track leading toward it from behind the boundary field, but it is badly overgrown and not maintained. One would not come upon the place by chance. No, said Miss Marple, not without a reason. Or without a map, said Miss Pell. Quite. They sat for a moment in one of those silences that are not empty but full of agreement. Both had arrived by somewhat different paths at the same conclusion. Miss Pell then spoke again, more thoughtfully. I have also been considering the usefulness of such a place during the war. A wheel pit in a derelict mill would be extremely well suited to concealment. It is stone-lined, protected from ordinary erosion, enclosed enough to shelter whatever might be placed there, and yet sufficiently ordinary in a surveyor's records to excite no alarm. If a symbol for the mill appeared on a map, few would see anything remarkable in it. Unless, said Miss Marple quietly, they knew both what the symbol meant and what had been put there. Precisely. Miss Marple poured more tea. As she did so, she found herself thinking again of Arthur Bellham, the careful surveyor, the man of method, who had crossed and recrossed the land around the quarry in the summer of 1942, recording structures, boundaries, and access points with professional precision. A man who later wrote, in guarded language, of discovering some impropriety connected with matters entrusted to his care. A man who left the village without naming the guilty party. One could imagine, only too easily, the kind of person who might make use of a surveyor's knowledge while lacking the surveyor's scruples. An assistant, for instance. She set down the teapot. Miss Pell, she said, you mentioned earlier that a man visited the county archive some 15 years ago to examine Bellham's survey records. Yes. Did the archivist say anything at all about him? Miss Pell considered. Only in general terms. Elderly, though that may be relative. Well-dressed. Someone accustomed, she thought, to being taken seriously in official places. There was one detail she remembered very clearly, however. When she offered to have copies made of the documents, he became noticeably stiff and declined at once. He said he only wished to satisfy himself on certain matters. As though, said Miss Marple, he was not seeking information, but verifying how much of it remained. That was my impression. Miss Marple absorbed that with care. A man who wished not to learn but to assess the extent of surviving danger was a man already in possession of the truth. The question before him would not have been what the records meant, but whether they still constituted a threat. I should like, Miss Marple said after a moment, to know rather more about Leonard Graves before he became Leonard Graves of the Parish Council. Miss Pell looked at her with immediate comprehension. I had begun to think the same. His place in the village feels older than it actually is. He has authority here, but not roots, not of the kind people assume. He would have been of the right age, said Miss Marple, to have been a young man during the war, young enough to serve as an assistant, old enough to know exactly what he was doing. I can investigate, Miss Pell said. There are always records, said Miss Marple. Yes, said Miss Pell. That is both the comfort and the difficulty of them. She left shortly after noon, moving off with the quiet, purposeful decisiveness Miss Marple had come to admire in her. When she'd gone, Miss Marple returned to the copied map and looked for a long time at the double circle. The mill stood some 400 yards from the place where Philip Dawson had been found. A man attempting to follow the map through unfamiliar symbols might naturally make first for the quarry, mistaking it for the principal point of interest, or merely arriving there on the most obvious route toward the mill. He need not have reached the true destination to be stopped. Miss Marple did not allow that thought to develop too far, not yet. She preferred fact to dramatic imagination, and the mind, once excited, is capable of doing dreadful harm to accuracy. Still, the relationship of the symbols had become clearer. The quarry was not the end point. It never had been. It was merely the place one came to first. Philip Dawson had not reached the mill. He had not needed to, because someone else, long before Philip Dawson bought an old travel guide for sixpence in a charity shop, had understood exactly what the map meant, and had decided, with the desperate firmness of a person protecting something old and dangerous, that the question it raised must go no further. The afternoon remained very still beyond the window, the garden keeping its late autumn colours with quiet persistence. At last Miss Marple folded the copied map carefully and placed it in the drawer of her writing table. Tomorrow, she thought, she must speak again to Inspector Ramsden. Chapter 8. The clues everyone else missed. It has often been said, usually by people fond of broad statements, that truth arrives like lightning. Miss Marple had never found this to be the case. Lightning may illuminate, but it does not explain. The most important discoveries in her experience came not from sudden revelation, but from accumulation. A phrase remembered here, a face connected there, a date that matches a place, a reaction too sharp to be accidental, a silence more eloquent than any speech. Each detail by itself appears of limited value, yet the mind, if supplied with enough such fragments and given time to lay them side by side, eventually recognizes the pattern they were always forming. The sensation is not one of violent surprise. It is rather like recognizing a familiar face in an unexpected room. The elements were already known. One has merely at last seen them in their proper relation. Miss Marple had come very near that point by Sunday morning. She had not spoken to Inspector Ramsden on Saturday, though she had meant to do so. Saturday evening had brought a letter from a niece requiring a tactful and rather lengthy reply, and Sunday itself began with an unfortunate disagreement between Miss Marple and the kitchen tap regarding the appropriate force with which water ought to emerge. By the time these domestic matters had been brought to a tolerable conclusion, she found she preferred the remaining hours before luncheon to pass quietly in her armchair, with her knitting in her hands and her thoughts arranged before her in the order they deserved. She was thinking about Leonard Graves, or rather, she was thinking about the kind of man Leonard Graves appeared to be, which was often a more useful exercise than meditating on the limited facts immediately available. Miss Marple had always believed that people belonged, in a broad and practical sense, to recognizable human categories. Not identical ones, of course. Human beings differ infinitely in detail, but similar enough in impulse that one might often learn much from comparison. Leonard Graves was a man of established respectability. This was not in itself a criticism. Respectability could be real, hard-earned, and entirely admirable. But like most virtues, it possessed its shadow. The shadow of respectability is the terror of losing it. In persons who have built their lives upon that foundation, the fear of collapse may become stronger than conscience. Such people are not always wicked in the common sense. More often they are individuals who have once done something wrong, or allowed something wrong to remain uncorrected, and have then spent years, even decades, maintaining the structure erected around that original fault. They mend the cracks as they appear. They patch surfaces. They distract attention. They become devoted not to goodness, but to preservation. Miss Marple had known several of the type. They were often more to be pitied than condemned. Yet pity did not make them harmless. On the contrary, prolonged fear has a way of wearing down judgment, and a threatened secret may drive otherwise orderly people into very disorderly acts. Miss Pell arrived at 2 o'clock that afternoon, somewhat sooner than expected, with a folder of notes which she spread on the table before the fire. Leonard Graves, she said without preamble, was born in 1901 in Shropshire, the second son of a solicitor. He received a conventional education and entered professional life as a surveyor's assistant in the early 1920s. He worked for several firms over roughly a decade. Miss Marple was not surprised. So by 1941 and 42, she said, he would have been experienced, though not fully qualified. Exactly. Competent, practical, and well-trained in the sort of work Belham was doing. And Belham? Miss Pell glanced at her notes. I found a supplementary list in the county wartime correspondence relating to the land survey programme. Bellum appears as Principal Surveyor. Under him, listed as Assistant L. Graves. There was no theatrical emphasis in her voice. Miss Pell was a researcher, not a dramatist. She trusted facts to carry their own force. The appointment begins in March 1941, she continued. There is no formal termination date for Graves, just as there is none for Bellum. The records simply cease in the autumn of 1942. Which fits, said Miss Marple softly, with Bellum's departure. Yes. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully into the fire. And afterward? Commerce, said Miss Pell. More precisely, property. By the late 1940s, he was buying and selling rural land on a modest scale. By the mid-1950s, he had evidently accumulated sufficient capital to retire from active work and live comfortably. There is nothing irregular in that on the surface, Miss Marple said. No. Post-war property values rose sharply, and a man who understood boundaries, access, land quality, and legal descriptions could certainly make advantageous purchases. A man, said Miss Marple, who understood land, and perhaps knew rather more about certain parcels than others did. Miss Pell met that quietly. I thought of that. I cannot prove it, but the capital must have originated somewhere, and the timing is suggestive. If a man had access in the immediate post-war period to assets that were not his and not easily traced, that might explain a rather comfortable beginning. The fire gave a small crack and settled lower. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, but did not work at it. She was thinking now of Mrs. Dorothy Crane and of her late husband, whose books had contained the map. He too had once worked as an assistant to a surveyor. He too had later gone into commerce. He too had prospered. Mrs. Crane had recalled, with that uncertain but often telling retrospective unease, that her husband never spoke comfortably of that period in his life. So there had been 2 young assistants, present during Bellum's wartime survey work, both leaving the district afterward, both entering profitable civilian lives. But there was a distinction. Mr. Crane was dead. Whatever burden of knowledge or guilt he had carried had gone with him. He had left only traces, hesitations, old discomforts, books not entirely sorted, a hidden map preserved without explanation. Leonard Graves, however, was alive. Leonard Graves had visited the county archive some 15 years earlier to determine what Bellum's surviving records still contained. Leonard Graves had reacted with wholly disproportionate sharpness at the parish council meeting when Miss Pell mentioned Bellum. And Leonard Graves, Miss Marple now thought, with growing certainty had almost certainly recognised the map the instant Philip Dawson displayed it in the tea-room. She turned her mind back to that Tuesday afternoon. She had not known, then, what would later matter, but years of habit had taught her to notice rooms as a whole. Who leaned in, who held back, who spoke too readily, who pretended indifference. Mrs. Patton and Miss Luring had bent over the paper with cheerful curiosity. Gerald Hartfield had remained at the window with his newspaper. Others had crowded nearer, and Leonard Graves. Yes, she could see him now in memory, not joining the cluster, not handling the sheet, not allowing himself the risky intimacy of close examination. He had stayed at a slight distance and watched. At the time it had seemed no more than temperament. Some people are naturally less eager in groups, but if a man recognised what he was seeing, if he understood it at once and knew what danger it represented, then distance would be the instinctive choice. Better not to touch it. Better not to betray oneself by too immediate a reaction. Better to observe. Philip Dawson, meanwhile, had been a sociable enthusiast. That type is among the easiest to understand. He delighted in puzzles and in sharing them. He would not have concealed his excitement. It was entirely likely he mentioned his intention to follow the map to someone he met in the intervening 2 days. He may even have spoken directly to Leonard Graves, casually, generously, with that harmless openness people often display when they have no notion that another person has reason to fear them. He might have said he meant to walk out to the Quarry on Thursday morning and see what the old drawing led to. That would have been enough. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Miss Pell," she said, I should like you to be present when I speak to Inspector Ramsden. Not because I expect difficulty persuading him. He is an intelligent man and will understand once the facts are properly arranged, but because you have assembled those facts with great thoroughness, and it seems to me only right that your work should be acknowledged by the person who must now act upon it." Miss Pell looked at her with an expression containing equal parts surprise and quiet gratification. "I am glad it has been of use," she said. "It has been much more than of use," said Miss Marple. "It has been exact, and exactness in matters of this kind is invaluable." Outside, the Sunday afternoon was declining in the resigned and almost graceful way October afternoons do. The light thinned from gold to grey. A door closed somewhere along the lane. A dog barked once, and then reconsidered the matter. The village seemed very still. Miss Marple looked into the fire and thought about two young men walking the parish lands in the summer of 1942. One careful, principled and precise, the other perhaps equally careful but not equally principled. One had discovered something, the other had seen opportunity in it, and what followed from that long-ago difference in character had taken years, decades even, to ripen into consequence. But consequences, Miss Marple reflected, have a remarkable patience, and sooner or later they arrive. Chapter 9. Uncovering the Secret Reason. Inspector Ramsden arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on Monday morning at precisely 10 o'clock, the hour she had suggested in her note, and which he had confirmed by telephone the previous evening. He came alone, which pleased her. Not because she wished to control the conversation. Miss Marple was never so vain as to imagine that official proceedings depended upon her management, but because she had observed, on more than one instructive occasion, that the presence of additional officials had a way of stiffening a discussion at exactly the moment when it most required freedom. A room containing too much authority often discouraged the small, revealing transitions by which understanding advances. He accepted tea as before, and settled into the visitor's armchair with the composed air of a man who had learned not to underestimate either a place or the person receiving him in it. Miss Pell occupied the straight-backed chair Miss Marple had borrowed from the writing table, and drawn closer to the fire for the occasion. She had brought her folder and held it with the contained readiness of someone who had been asked for facts and had brought them in proper order. Miss Marple herself sat opposite, her knitting in her hands, for she had always found that a sensible occupation for the fingers improved the discipline of thought. "I ought to say at once," she began, "that what I have to offer is not evidence in the strict legal sense. I understand the distinction perfectly well. What I have is a coherent account of what I believe occurred, supported by a series of details which, taken together, seem to me too consistent to be accidental. You will form your own conclusions, of course, and properly so." Ramsden inclined his head. "I am listening," he said. Miss Marple began with the tea-room. She described the scene as she'd seen it at the time, not embroidered by hindsight, but with the addition of the one detail memory had since restored to its proper importance. Leonard Graves standing apart at the counter, not joining the little group around Philip Dawson's discovery, not handling the paper, but watching it. Ramsden made a note without interruption. She moved then to what Miss Pell had established: Arthur Belham's wartime survey work, the surviving official records, and the personnel list placing Leonard Graves in the parish as Belham's assistant from March of 1941 onward. She spoke of Cyril Mossop's letter, the careful, guarded letter Belham had written to Mrs. Alderton, suggesting that something entrusted to wartime safekeeping arrangements had been improperly dealt with. She described the visit to the county archive some 15 years earlier by a man who had not seemed to be discovering information, but measuring what remained of it. At this point Ramsden looked up. The archivist could not identify that visitor. "She could not name him," said Miss Marple. "Her description, elderly, well-dressed, accustomed to being taken seriously in official places, is not inconsistent with Leonard Graves at a somewhat earlier date, but I would not press the matter too far. It is suggestive, not conclusive." "Noted," said Ramsden, and wrote again. She went on to Mrs. Crane's visit, the donated book, her late husband's connection to Bellam's survey work as another assistant, the indirect hints that something unpleasant had occurred in that period, something Mr. Crane had never cared to examine too closely. Here Miss Marple was very exact, carefully distinguishing between what Mrs. Crane had actually said and the interpretation she herself had placed upon it. "Mr. Crane is dead," she said. "He cannot be questioned. And I do not believe Mrs. Crane knows more than she told me. She came because she was troubled, and because speaking to the police directly felt too large a step for what she could provide, which was context rather than proof." "I shall speak to her," said Ramsden in a gentler tone. "I had hoped you would." Then they came to the mill. Miss Pell took over briefly, with the quiet competence of someone explaining a technical point she fully understood. She described the symbol on the map, the derelict mill to the northeast of the quarry, the surviving stone-lined wheel pit, its seclusion, and the fact that one would not discover it by chance. Ramsden listened with the close, practical attention of a man realizing that the landscape he had already examined was not, in fact, the landscape he had yet understood. "The quarry," said Miss Marple, resuming, "was not Philip Dawson's destination. It lay on the natural approach toward the mill, and I believe he was making his way in that direction when he was found, or, more accurately, when he was stopped." She paused. In the silence the fire gave a small, settled sound, and Ramsden laid his pen down. "You are saying," he began carefully, "that Dawson did not go to the quarry by choice." "I am saying that the quarry was not the place he intended ultimately to reach. Whether he came to it simply by following the route implied by the map, or whether another person intercepted him there, or whether there was some understanding that a conversation should take place before he went farther, I cannot say with certainty." She looked at him steadily. "What I can say with some confidence is that Philip Dawson was exactly the sort of man to mention his plans freely. He was an enthusiast, not a conspirator. If Leonard Graves became aware after the tea-room gathering that Philip intended to follow the map out toward the mill, he would at once have understood the danger." Ramsden was silent for a moment. "Why danger?" he asked. "If the valuables were taken in the 1940s, then they were taken long ago. There would be nothing left." "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "There would be nothing left, but that is not at all the same thing as nothing remaining." She folded her hands over her knitting. A stone-lined structure preserves traces remarkably well. A methodical man like Philip Dawson, examining such a place carefully, might not have found the hidden items themselves, but he might have found evidence that something had once been concealed there, remnants of a container, fragments of wrappings, some indication of deliberate storage. And what would matter even more, in my opinion, is this: Arthur Bellam was a careful man. Such a man records what is entrusted to him. It is entirely possible that with the hidden items he left some form of written note, a list, perhaps, of what had been placed there and for whom. She allowed that thought to settle before continuing. If such a record survived and were found, it would not merely show that something had once been hidden at the mill, it would show what had later disappeared. And from that, at least morally and socially, one might infer very plainly who had taken it. Not in a way likely to satisfy a court after 80 years, perhaps, but certainly in a way that would devastate a man who had spent decades building a reputation for soundness, propriety, and public respectability. Ramsden picked up his pen again. "And so," said Miss Marple, "when Leonard Graves realised Dawson intended to visit the mill, he could not permit it. I do not imagine he set out that morning with murder fully formed in his mind. That would be too simple, and human beings are rarely so neat in their wrongdoing. I think he meant to stop Philip, to discourage him, divert him, perhaps argue him out of it. But when two men stand on uncertain ground beside a quarry edge, and one of them is driven not by anger, but by long accumulated fear, a push need not be premeditated in order to be fatal." She said the word quietly. No more than that was required. "I think Leonard Graves is a man who spent 40 years managing an old dishonesty," she said, "and who found, on one October morning, that the management of it had at last exceeded his strength." The room was very still. Miss Pell sat with her folder closed upon her knee, her hands folded over it. She was not expressive by nature, but Miss Marple thought there was in her face the concentrated seriousness of someone who had seen patient research harden, at last, into a pattern no longer deniable. Ramsden looked down at his notebook for a long while before speaking. "What you have given me," he said at last, "is a motive and a coherent circumstantial framework. It is a good deal more than I had this morning, and a good deal clearer than anything I have yet been told officially. But I shall need to establish Graves's movements on Thursday morning, determine whether anyone saw him on the quarry path, and have the site examined again with proper attention." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "naturally. I am not offering this as a substitute for evidence, only as a direction." "It is a direction," Ramsden agreed. He closed his notebook. Then he looked at her with a slight hesitation, as though choosing between politeness and sincerity. He chose sincerity. "Miss Marple," he said, "this is a clearer account of a complicated matter than I have received from any formal source. I am grateful for it." "I am glad it is useful," she said. Philip Dawson was a pleasant man who did nothing more reckless than buy an old book and take an intelligent interest in what he found inside it. That seemed to me to deserve proper attention. Ramsden rose, collected his coat from the hall where Miss Marple had hung it upon his arrival, and said goodbye to both ladies with the composed, purposeful air of a man who had already determined upon his next steps and wished to be about them at once. Miss Pell left soon afterwards, declining further tea with a small smile and the remark that she had several things to attend to. Miss Marple translated this correctly as meaning that she wished to be alone with her thoughts for a little while, which was entirely understandable. When both had gone, Miss Marple remained in her chair. She was thinking of Leonard Graves, not only as the man he had become, but as the young man he must once have been, crossing autumn fields beside Arthur Bellum in 1942, learning the lie of the land, recognising the opportunities it offered, and making at some point a decision which perhaps at first had seemed manageable. Human beings are peculiarly gifted in that regard. They often suppose that one small wrong, cleverly handled, can be made to remain small forever. They do not sufficiently account for the slow, terrible weight of years. Miss Marple felt, as she so often did when a line of reasoning reached its conclusion, not triumph, but something quieter and infinitely sadder. A fatigue not of body, but of spirit. Sorrow for the commonplace weakness from which grave harm so often grows. The fire burned steadily. The clock marked the progress of the morning in its reliable voice. Outside, under the pale October sky, the village went about its ordinary business, quite unaware that in one modest sitting-room a quiet reckoning had just been set irrevocably in motion. Chapter 10. Nightfall settles. Over St. Mary Mead. The last days of October came to St. Mary Mead with a gentleness almost considerate in character, as though the season itself had judged the village to have had enough of sharpness for 1 month, and now offered something milder in return. The mornings were still cool, of course, but not unkindly so, and the afternoons retained a little warmth, enough to encourage a person to linger by a window, or to walk once around the garden more than necessity strictly required before the light withdrew. The elms had shed nearly all their leaves by then, and stood in the pale sunshine with that clean, unburdened aspect which trees acquire only when they have surrendered what they no longer need to carry. Miss Marple had always found the end of October more affecting than its beginning. There was something instructive in the stripped condition of the world at that time of year. Once abundance had gone, structure showed itself. Hedges became lines again. Branches resumed their proper shapes. The unnecessary fell away, and one saw what had been present all along. It seemed to her a lesson of wider application than gardening. Truth, too, often emerged only after ornament, assumption, and convenience had been removed. The truth about Philip Dawson's death, when it came, emerged by degrees and through proper channels in just that fashion. Inspector Ramsden proved as thorough and patient as Miss Marple had expected. Within the following 10 days he located 2 witnesses, a farm labourer who habitually walked the eastern boundary of Callow Farm at first light, and a woman whose health required her to keep early hours. Both had seen Leonard Graves on the quarry path at a time which placed him there before Alfred Cook made his grim discovery. A second examination of the ground, conducted with more intelligence than the first, produced indications consistent with a struggle of the quiet, undramatic kind that leaves little for the careless eye, but, to the careful one, arranges itself into a persuasive whole. And then there was the mill. Ramsden went there himself, accompanied by a constable and by a professional surveyor from the county office, who could read Bellum's notation properly and a line map with ground. The wheel pit, just as Miss Pell had said, had endured. It was stone-lined and sheltered, and at its base, beneath years of silt, leaves, and damp accumulation, they found the remains of a tin box. It was no longer intact. Tin seldom survives 8 decades of moisture without surrendering something. But it had endured sufficiently to preserve part of what mattered. Inside were the remains of a folded paper in Bellum's neat surveyor's hand. It was, as Miss Marple had supposed, an inventory, a list of items entrusted for concealment, with names, descriptions, and the families to whom they belonged. Time had not been wholly kind to it, but enough remained legible to establish its purpose beyond real doubt. The families themselves could not, in the end, be traced in any useful way. Some had gone, some lines had ended, some records had dissolved into the ordinary confusions of war, movement, marriage, and death. That particular path yielded nothing but the quiet melancholy that attaches itself to property outliving memory. The items themselves, jewellery, silver, and a small quantity of papers valuable more for private meaning than financial worth, had long since vanished through whatever discreet transactions Leonard Graves had arranged in the years immediately after the war. There could be no recovery now, and no one remaining to receive restitution. Yet the list was enough for Ramsden's purpose. It proved that Bellum had made a formal record. It proved that the record had been hidden at the mill. And it proved, by plain implication, that what had been entrusted there had later been removed by someone who knew precisely where to look, and who had chosen possession over return. When Ramsden called at Leonard Graves's house on the east side of the village, Graves did not bluster, protest, or invent elaborate denials. Miss Marple thought, when she later heard the account, that this was perhaps the most revealing detail of all. A man who has spent 40 years maintaining a surface seldom tries, once that surface has finally collapsed, to manufacture a new one. He sat, Ramsden said, in a comfortable sitting room full of well-chosen things, the room of a man who had lived carefully and prospered with discretion, and after a long silence remarked only that he supposed it had been bound to come out in the end. He did not say he was sorry. He said instead that he had told himself for many years that the original owners were gone, that there was no one left to return such things to, even had he wished to return them. He offered this not with conviction, but with the exhausted mechanical tone of a man reciting an argument, worn smooth by repetition, and long since robbed of all force, even for himself. He admitted, too, that Philip Dawson had telephoned him on Wednesday evening. Philip, in the cheerful, unguarded way Miss Marple had perfectly anticipated, had mentioned his intention of following the map toward the old mill on Thursday morning. He had even asked Leonard, in passing and with complete innocence, whether Leonard knew anything about the place, having heard that he had once worked in a surveying capacity in that district. Leonard had denied any knowledge of it. Then, as he later admitted, he had lain awake most of the night. At dawn he dressed and went out. He met Philip Dawson on the quarry path. There had been a conversation. The conversation had become an argument, and the argument, as Miss Marple had inferred, ended not in some coldly arranged design, but in a moment of desperate force upon ground that offered no margin for error. Graves did not call it an accident. Ramsden noted their admission carefully. He said only that he had not gone there meaning it to happen, which may well have been true as far as it went, though truth, Miss Marple reflected, often goes only part of the necessary distance. Others, in due course, would determine how much such a statement was worth. Leonard Graves resigned from the parish council by letter, delivered by hand to the chairman the following morning. Shortly thereafter he left the village quietly, and by the turn of the season his house had been sold to a young couple with no connection whatever to the place's older history. Villages are extraordinarily efficient in absorbing such transitions. The house continued to stand where it always had. Its windows reflected the same afternoon light. The garden received its ordinary seasonal trimming. By November, passing it in the lane, one could almost imagine that nothing exceptional had ever attached to it at all. Miss Marple observed all this partly from her sitting-room window, and partly through those soft social currents by which village life distributes its knowledge. The matter was discussed thoroughly for a fortnight, and then, as such matters are, was succeeded by other concerns. There was a new family at the old rectory. The church roof fund received a substantial anonymous donation. Mrs. Fry introduced a walnut cake of real merit at the tea-room. Life, as it generally does, redistributed its attention without any great ceremony. Cyril Mossop placed Bellum's letter, the careful one, with its guarded reference to something improperly removed, among the Historical Society's archived materials, adding a brief note of context for the benefit of future serious readers. He did not print it in the Society newsletter, which seemed to Miss Marple exactly right. Some things should be preserved in the historical record without being offered up for general village entertainment. The original map, once Ramsden's office had released it, was transferred at Miss Pell's suggestion, and with the Historical Society's approval to the county archive among the parish documents, where it would be properly catalogued and available to anyone with a legitimate reason to consult it. It was entered under Arthur Bellum's name, which Miss Marple thought both accurate and just. Whatever failures of courage or resolution had attended his departure from the village in 1942, he had nevertheless been a careful and gifted draftsman, and the map was honest evidence of that. It seemed fitting that his hand should at last be properly acknowledged. On the last evening of October, Miss Marple sat by the sitting-room window with her knitting, the pale blue piece now considerably further advanced than it had been at the month's beginning, and watched the light move slowly across the garden in that particular autumn fashion. Lo, amber, and very soon gone. She found herself thinking about maps. They were curious things, really, if one considered them properly. They preserved a world as it had existed at the moment of their making, the boundaries, the structures, the routes from one place to another. Then the world moved on while the map remained still. A map drawn in 1942 showed a landscape that no longer existed in quite the same form. Mills since collapsed, paths grown over, boundaries softened by time and neglect. Yet the map was not wrong. It was merely historical. It held, faithfully, the shape of a moment which could no longer be revisited, but could with patience still be understood. Philip Dawson had found such a map in a charity shop and seen in it the pleasure of a puzzle. He had approached it with the openness of a man who believed curiosity to be harmless, which was, on the whole, a generous and reasonable belief. That in this case it had proved dangerous was not a failing in him. It was the consequence of an old history that had waited, silent and unseen, for 80 years before reaching forward to meet him on an October morning. Miss Marple thought of him with real warmth. She remembered the long face bent over the tea-room table, the hands rubbing together in cheerful anticipation, the simple pleasure with which he had offered his discovery to anyone willing to be interested. There had been nothing complicated about Philip Dawson. That, she thought, had been both his particular charm and the thing that placed him at risk. She drew another length of pale blue wool through her fingers and continued her work. Evening gathered softly over the village. One by one the cottage windows lit. St. Mary Mead settled into its familiar nighttime quiet with the ease of a place that had accommodated many events across many years and had learned, through long practice, how to remain fundamentally itself in spite of them. "Maps," said Miss Marple aloud at last, though to no one in particular, "may show us where to go, but they cannot tell us what sort of person we shall be when we get there." She spoke without emphasis, as one does when finishing a thought that has been turning quietly for some time and has at last arranged itself into proper words. The fire settled in the grate. The clock marked the hour in its small, dependable voice. Outside, the last light faded from the October sky, and the mystery became one more quiet story absorbed into the long memory of the village, which had held many such stories before and would hold many more after. And St. Mary Mead continued into evening as it always did, warm behind its windows, patient and, on the surface at least, entirely at peace.